Well, hello and welcome back to Midweek Mashup. Today I'm sitting down with Pastor Eric, and we're going over your message on the gospel.
The gospel, yes.
Yeah. Interesting fun fact that I learned from the Bible Project recently is that the gospels are actually the gospel.
Yes.
And it's all one kind of cohesive sort of thing. And
so, the Bible Project was a good source for this message. Their series on the gospel was really, really helpful. So I tried to pack a lot in. And it's also, the tough part about Sunday's message is it's part one. And then we have a week on the Bible. And then we get part two, which is like, how do we become people of the gospel? So it's like not a finished product. It's got to be, you got to come back to it. So anyway, but that Bible Project series was really helpful in preparation.
One of the things that we've talked about a lot is church history.
Yes.
And one of the things that you talked about on Sunday is kind of like, hey, these things get really complicated. Oh, yeah. Let's simplify it a little bit. This is totally unplanned, unscripted. I wanted to see just like from the time of the church, like early church, can you walk us through stretch your church history muscle. And like, what are all these divisions that make everything so complicated?
Yeah.
Like, so what are these groups?
Early in the church, there were just a bunch of like, kind of house churches. Really, is what it was. Like even you read in Acts 16, you see Lydia like hosting the church in Macedonia in her home. Like that's the church in Macedonia starts there, right? And it's very decentralized, but they're connected to the apostles, and they're trying to figure out how to work out this faith that they have, and it really functions a lot like that. Now, some meetings happen in synagogues where, as a gathering place, but it's a pretty like decentralized kind of underground movement in a lot of ways. At least in the West, you see things start happening in places like Ethiopia really quickly too. And so when we talk about this kind of church history, we're usually talking about Europe, and but there's about the sometime in the 4th century. I don't have all my dates because I wasn't prepared, but Constantine becomes emperor and of Rome, and is some sort of Christian, and makes it like okay to be Christian in the Roman Empire for the first time. There's a little bit of backlash to that and some follow-up emperors, but eventually it becomes the state-sponsored religion. And so now not only is it okay to be a Christian, it's actually advantageous to be a Christian. So they have this massive, influx of people into these churches, and there's a couple of things that happened that were probably pretty negative. They build a lot of hierarchy because what are we going to do with all these people? We got to figure out like how, communion goes from something that's more of a meal around the table of a extended spiritual family, as we like to call it, to a huge building with a bunch of people all meeting at once, and it becomes an institutionalized thing where a priest has to serve you the communion now because we've got to make sure that it's handled well. And so the influx of people leads to this need to control everything. And then additionally, it's the state-sponsored religion of the Roman Empire, and which eventually becomes called the Holy Roman Empire, which is very Roman and not so holy. And so instead of being a movement that was, largely nonviolent, refused to allow the world power of Rome to get them to shift what they believed and what they did. And now everybody in Rome is essentially a Christian, and they're just being Romans. They don't really, many don't care about Jesus. It's just a part of the culture now. It's civil religion, essentially. So that's the first big, problematic thing that happens. And then this goes on for a long time, and there's a huge schism in the church, or about 1,000 years after Jesus. Again, I don't know my dates exactly, where all of a sudden the church in the East, so think Orthodox Christianity, Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox of all kind, break apart from the Catholic Church. And their arguments are, I would call them relatively minor, but you can see culturally why they saw things differently than the Catholics and felt like they needed to do their own thing. Still, the liturgical stuff is very similar, but some differences of opinion, and that goes on for for another like 500-ish years until the Protestant Reformation comes around. And so, the Protestant Reformation, led by people like Martin Luther and Zwingli and John Calvin, and they have a lot of problems with what they see as abuse of power and bad theology within the Catholic Church. And where this intersects with our sermon from this past week is Paul talks about, salvation comes through faith, not through works. And for Luther and Calvin and others, they felt like, well, the Roman Catholics are giving you a checklist of what you have to do, and if you're not really good all the time, you're at the very least you're going to end up in purgatory, and even worse, maybe even hell, but if you do these things, or maybe pay for these indulgences, or you say enough Hail Marys, to the priest, then God will forgive you, right? And that's a gross oversimplification, but that's how they saw it, right? And they were like, well, no, you're saved by faith alone, not through any works. And so it swung like totally in the other direction. And Luther and Calvin certainly wouldn't. Like this again, I'm doing a very gross characterization of this. They wouldn't say that the gospel doesn't transform your life, but they want to make sure that people understand that it's the finished work of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection that brings us new life. But it leads to all sorts of problems. The Reformers were much more in touch with Greek philosophy. They loved Plato and Aristotle, and they really wanted to make those guys Christians, and so they're much more in tune with the Greek philosophy that comes from those guys than they are with the Hebrew Bible, and that's where some of the problems come into the Protestant Reformation, where it's like almost like the body doesn't matter, right? And that's a very Greek kind of Gnostic way of thinking of things, that it's the soul, and that it's this transaction that the gospel is this transaction where Jesus does this thing for you so that you can have eternal life. And the Bible doesn't say that at all. I mentioned in my sermon that if you were to Google gospel and heaven, all it says is the gospel has come from heaven as a gift from God. It doesn't say that the gospel gets you into heaven. And if you Google gospel and hell, 0 results come up. Right. So, I'll finish this thought there. Like, how did we get there? Like that's the question I wanted to ask. We have the gospel is all over the Bible. This word gospel and the phrase good news is all over the Bible. And the Bible doesn't say anything about getting us into heaven and hell. And yet through the Roman Catholics and the Protestants, that's what they seem to be obsessed with, is this idea that our souls need to go somewhere when we die, and where does it go? And the gospel must be about that, because it seems like the stakes are really high. I don't mean to say that the Bible or the gospel don't speak into those things, but I do think that there's a much bigger conversation going on. And so we need to go past the Reformation. We need to go past, the schisms and the Constantinian takeover of the church, and get back to what does the Bible say in its context, and then build from there. Doesn't mean we ignore church history, but it just means we have to acknowledge that church history has shaped us in ways that we might not be conscious of if we don't really dig deep.
Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, that was a lot.
Sorry. On the spot. No, it's so good. Because like that's stuff that I learned in seminary.
Right.
But for me, like that's kind of stuff that goes in one ear, out the other.
Right.
And I like having it on video so I can go back and refresh.
Yeah.
And so I feel like that's beneficial.
Yeah.
Because even that, like, that's just like the major schisms that have happened.
Oh, there's so much more. Yeah.
Yeah.
That doesn't even get into
hours.
like,
yeah.
I mean, we can get into Puritan Christianity in the Americas and how it's shaped the church that we have today. And that's a whole nother, can of worms that will probably be uncomfortable.
Yeah. Yeah. I just checked my notes because we won't go into every theological difference.
Yes.
But essentially when it comes to theology and social issues, there is 97 quadrillion different permutations of theology that you can hold.
Cool.
And so it's bringing back the question that you posed on Sunday, like, okay, if you say the gospel, like which gospel?
Right.
Like, because the gospel could be different for every single person. So is that really like a helpful conversation to be having, to say like, oh, well, all of these secondary issues that I hold, they're the right ones.
Right.
Versus like, okay, well, what does Jesus actually say the gospel is? So I really appreciated your message on Sunday. And I think simplifying is really helpful. For someone who is kind of grew up in that mindset where it's like, well, we're here on earth. I want to go to heaven because that's the good place. Yeah. And I don't want to go to hell because that's the bad place. How do we not swing the pendulum so far in the other direction of that, like, oversimplification?
Right. That's the interesting thing, is that the Bible does speak about resurrection, and it does speak about judgment. And because of course it does. What is mankind's greatest fear? It's death, right? And it's something that we clearly don't have an answer for. And if you want to get really sad and or laugh, just look at what different billionaires are doing to try to live forever. It's really weird. One guy was injecting himself with his son's blood because it's young blood, and that will help. This is a person whose money has solved every problem he thinks in his life, and knows he can't solve this one, and is desperate to try. And instead of turning to Jesus or any other kind of hope, he's still putting himself in his own wisdom. Anyway, all that to say, this is the problem that we've faced forever, is that we live and we die, and what does that mean, and what happens after that? And the tricky part is we want a sense of certainty with that, and yet the Bible gives us parables and metaphors. And that doesn't mean that we can't learn anything from them. It's just, it's not as concrete as we'd like. I would like for somebody to say, when you die, this is exactly what happens step by step. And then, there it is. And the Bible doesn't necessarily give us that. N.T. Wright has some great stuff on this where, when we die, the idea of going to heaven, or as Jesus puts it when he talks to the thief on the cross, is today you'll be with me in paradise. He's like, that's not the ultimate hope. The ultimate hope is resurrection. That's the promise of the gospel, is that because Jesus is Lord, the way N.T. Wright puts it is like when God became king upon his resurrection and ascension, that once and for all crushed the power of death. Meaning resurrection is real, and a physical resurrection and a new heaven and a new earth, a restored creation. That's the hope that comes through believing in Jesus as Lord. To say Jesus is Lord is to believe that he has defeated our greatest enemies, sin and death, right? And that does mean eternal life. And so that is great news. That is awesome. There is more than what we see. There is hope for us and those loved ones that we've lost. But if we only think it's about that, if I just believe that and then just sit in my bunker while I watch the world burn, am I really living as if Jesus is Lord, right? So it's not just about believing in the right things so that I can get to a place someday. It's about, Jesus is Lord. That changes everything. And that changes, my whole life needs to now align with that idea that Jesus is ruling. I need to live as if he's my king. You know, no matter what circumstances are, whether the culture around me is favorable to that or unfavorable to that, this is, if Jesus is Lord, then everything changes. So it's great to have that hope for the future, but we just don't sit around and like twiddle our thumbs and wait. We go and we not just pray, your kingdom come, your will be done. We go about doing the work of that. You know, I was talking to our partners in the Dominican Republic, and their theme for this year that they're really working through with their team, and then teams that come to serve with them, is your kingdom come in Santiago as it is in heaven, in Bobita, in Rio San Juan, the places where they're doing ministry. They're praying that nonstop, and then they're seeing, how do we join you there and participate in the kingdom breaking through here and now? So to me, that's simple. There is a hope for the future, and I've got a calling here and now, and both are the kingdom. Both are centered on Jesus as Lord.
Thanks for sitting down and sharing a little bit more about the gospel. If you want to hear more from Pastor Eric, I'll add a banner to his message on the gospel. And if you are interested in hearing more from us here at FCC, there's another video for you right here.